This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 471, featuring Kurt Gray, professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vasilopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey everybody, Jan Rutherford here, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us a part of your day as we study leaders. As I've said before, if you've got a challenge, issue, problem, opportunity, I betcha we've recorded an episode on that we can help you with. And we pride ourselves on the fact that we believe that all our episodes are evergreen. They do not expire.
Yeah. And, Jan, this morning I woke up and I had an email in my inbox from Paul Darley from the Darley Company. They're our sponsor. And I encourage everyone, if you have been listening to this podcast and want to learn more about their company, go to their website, sign up for their email list. Great content they put out there and really a lot of leadership stuff that they do. It's just they're fantastic people. But they are our sponsor. So this episode is brought to you by Darley. Their mission supports our military and first responders, the equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether that's a water pump, a drone, or emergency medical supplies. Learn more about them at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And our guest today is Kurt Gray. He received a PhD in social psychology from Harvard. His research investigates the causes and consequences of people's deepest beliefs, including morality and religion, and how best to bridge political divides. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Economist, Scientific American, Wired, regular on Hidden Brain and other podcasts, and has done multiple TEDx events. And I saw an article that Kurt wrote, and I said, God, I really want to have this guy on the show. And here you are, Kurt. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, well, we're excited. We're really excited to dig in here. What's not in the public bio? What can't we find out about you scouring the internet?
Well, I think you could probably find this if you read the book, but what I don't talk about is how I started out in geophysics before transitioning to psychology. So before I dug into people's minds, I dug not directly into the ground, but looking for natural gas in the Canadian wilderness. And, it was a hard pivot to psychology, but I think a lot of the skills of just spending time out in the wilderness, pounding stakes into the ground, can somehow prepare me for the future.
We had a prior guest on the show, Susan Morris, who discovered oil in Belize. And she kept trying to sell people on investing in Belize. And she was a geologist. And she said until she went and studied the layers of people's mind, she wasn't getting anyone to invest in it. And once she understood humans, the layers, then she got investor and she hit oil on the first drill.
Amazing. So not so far of a pivot then.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So what caught my eye was one of your articles, that evolution's gotten it all wrong. We're prey, not predators. And I was hiking the other day up the mountain in ankle deep snow. And we've had a lot of mountain lion activity here on the western slopes of Denver. And I'm hiking up there and I see mountain lion tracks everywhere. And I know it's the two cubs and the two adults that we've seen on our cameras, because I can see the little prints and the big ones. And I'm hiking and I've got a good field of vision all around me. And then all of a sudden I'm in this place where it's kind of wooded and there's a cliff on one side that's probably 20 feet up. And I'm like, if I was a mountain lion, this is where I'd hang out for an ambush. And anyway, as I was thinking, I was thinking about your work. I don't have claws. I don't have canines. I am not thinking about, I'm out here looking for something to kill. I'm thinking about, I have trekking poles and I can fight one off, but I'm pretty sure I can't fight 4 mountain lions off. I am prey. In my own work as an executive coach, I've realized that, we've spent a lot of time talking about what motivates people, but in reality, a lot of the behavior we see in the work world is based on fear, and you use the word harm. So I'd love to hear more about your whole premise and explain to the audience a little bit where where this is taking you, that we're prey, not predators, and how, that really informs your work.
Right. So, I study people's moral judgments and the hot button issues that we all face today and how people come on, one side of the issue or the other. And my research really argues that what we all share is this concern about harm, and we're driven to protect ourselves. And even if we disagree on an issue, we still have the same moral mind. But to understand that, you have to start millions of years ago, right? And if you think about evolution, if you think about, where we came from as humans, then you probably think about the dioramas you saw as a kid in museums, where like cave people wearing, bear skins with spears. And right, this argument that like we're apex predators. And it's true that today we are, right? So we can hunt wolves from helicopters. You can buy any kind of meat you want to buy. But if you really think about, who we were in the past and even how our bodies are today, as you say, right? It's a really different story, right? We're not in our heart of hearts apex predators, right? We're kind of fairly weak. And in the past, we were more likely to be hiding from predators, worried about getting eaten. And you can see this in your kids, right? Your kids are afraid of the dark. They're afraid what's under the bed. And if I challenge folks, like imagine that you go naked into the forest and dusk is falling and you hear a twig snap behind you. You don't think, oh boy, I think that's something for me to eat, right? You think that's something that's going to eat you. And
Right.
so
Yep.
we have it on its head, right? It's totally opposite. We are more hunted than hunter, and that matters in many ways.
Yeah. And so, let's take that to the fact that, we work in tribes, and we've got leaders, and, we've got to get things done, and there's pressure to get things done, and we want to win and, beat the enemy and all that. I mean, how does this apply, to the everyday, environments we find ourselves?
Right. I mean, it matters a ton for leaders if you're trying to think about what are the people on my team thinking? How am I going to motivate people? And of course, people are motivated by the things we all know about, right? I mean, we want to have prestige, we want to have money, we want to have the esteem of our friends. But if you go back and think about, well, why do we even work together in groups? Why do we live in tribes? Why do we work together? The question is still about protection, right? The reason that we work together is because that's the only way that humans can really survive. Like one human, naked in the wilderness is not going to live for very long. And so we need people to help us survive and thrive and to help us protect each other from the predators out there, right? The other folks, even the other kind of like other tribes who are out to get us, right? So we really need teams to help protect us. And that's kind of a primary motivation that I think a lot of people miss, right? That we see those threats and we need to manage those threats as teammates and as leaders.
Yeah, I have found this whole discussion to be so interesting. I don't even think we've mentioned your book yet. We got to mention it is Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Like, really good book. And so, what's really kind of funny, we're talking about whether we're predators or prey, and there's this kind of meme or this thing going around the internet right now about like, could 100 men defeat one gorilla? And then, there are arguments about like which 100 men, like if it was Shaquille O'Neal or someone else, And so it's just a funny discussion, but I mean, it's so obvious, like we're prey. What I do find interesting though is like we had a guest a while ago, Franz de Waal. That was like 228. He talked about, he's the guy who coined the term alpha males and like talked about leadership in the primate world. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I think this is like along the same vein, super fascinating. And so we've got this kind of instinctual, part of us as humans. And then we've got this logical prefrontal cortex that differentiates us. And we think like, oh my gosh, everything good happens there. But like, we know from all this work we've done on like decision making that so much of our decision making emanates from our emotions, but yet we're still convinced like facts and we argue about facts. Tell us a little bit about like what we get wrong, even understanding how our own brains work.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, right? that our emotions and our feelings and our gut feelings drive our decision making, right? It's all in the service of our feelings. And so if you feel worried, if you feel concerned or threatened, right, our decisions are made to protect ourselves. And because we have these kind of like really deep feelings about concern and threats and harm, that drives our decisions more than the kind of relatively recent importance of facts, right? We've elevated facts as being the most important thing maybe since the Enlightenment, a few hundred years ago. But it turns out that facts don't really convince us or allow us to grow respect for someone else as much as we might think. So we ran this study. We asked people, imagine someone disagrees with you on politics. What would it take for you to respect them in a conversation? What should they talk about? People say, you know what I want? I want the facts, right? Just like you said, I want the facts. And we say, great, here are those facts from the other side. And then people say, not those facts. Those are not the right facts. Those are not real facts, right? And so it turns out that facts are very flimsy, especially in cases where we have strong moral convictions. We think that they're not the right facts. We think that they're not relevant. If we're talking about guns or anything like this, right? Abortion, immigration, right? Yeah, put those facts aside. Where'd you get those facts from? Like, here are the real facts, right? And so you're absolutely right that the way our minds work is we're fixated on our emotions and our convictions and our feelings of concern and not facts.
So I want to talk about leadership, but let's start with kind of sales for a standpoint. Like for years in sales, people would say, you got to sell the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which, kind of goes to speaking to that part of you that feels your prey. Okay. So it's that victim kind of like, ooh, I don't want to be prey. Let's speak to someone's fears. But a lot of people shy away from that because it's like, wow, I don't always want to be on the downside, on the negative, So is I'm a leader and I want to help people through a situation, through some dilemma, or bring a team together. What can we do to build a culture within our organizations or within the people we have in our sphere of influence to kind of like manifest more success and, more cohesion?
I mean, I think, we're all concerned about threats. And I think there is an idea of truth of, you can sell products, you can maybe drive voters if you emphasize fears and threats because that's most primary. But I think you can also think about resilience, right? And getting people to kind of be more future facing and think about, it's not an imminent threat, but think about, well, how we can be stronger as a team, how we can face, future challenges and uncertainty in a way that helps us thrive, right? So if you're an athletic team, right, you can come together and beat the competition. And the way you do that isn't by like, oh my goodness, if we lose this, it's terrifying and everyone let's be terrified, right? That's not going to drive people to great performance. But you can still say, well, here's a challenge in the threat that we can rise to. So I think framing it in that way is like a positive way to kind of rise to the occasion, as opposed to, there's a boogeyman out there and it's going to get us all and watch out, right? And so I think it's a more approach-oriented way of facing those threats and challenges rather than an avoidance kind of way.
Kurt, I mean, there's a lot of dehumanization of others. There's a lot of outrage. I mean, that's the title of your book. What skills or mindsets, for leaders are most critical to be effective and empathetic?
I think at the end of the day, right, you have to see someone as three-dimensional. So I have a colleague and he likes to say that conflict flattens people, and it flattens people to just the opinion that they have that you disagree with, right? You fail to appreciate that this person maybe has the same moral sense that you do, has the same concerns, right? The same worries about their family and their future, that they like hobbies, right? And so I think what leaders need to do is really, especially in times of conflict, right, allow people to connect with each other over common concerns and common values that we all share. And I think organizations are really actually not easy, but good places to do this because good organizations have a good mission. They have a good set of values that we all kind of agree upon. That's why we're part of this organization. So highlighting that kind of higher level goal or mission that we all share, right? The values we're driving towards, I think goes a long way to kind of stopping this flattening that we get whenever there might be disagreement.
I think that's really good counsel. Let me get into like a specific scenario that's
Great.
it's kind of frustrating actually.
Is it about Jim?
No, not Jim. No, not Jim. You know, there's organizations that are operating and they've got core values, and you know they want to make sure that the people that join their company share their core values. And as coaches, what we're looking at is what are the behaviors that we see, what are the behaviors that we want. We're not psychologists. We don't try to figure out where do these behaviors come from. I'm seeing that there's clients that are basically saying, hey, it's not just enough about the behaviors. I want people to know, understand, believe certain things. To me, that has nothing to do with the behaviors, but they feel, boy, if people don't know, think, understand, believe what I believe, then their core values aren't good. And I think that's a sticky wicket to go down and say, well, people aren't a good fit if they don't believe, because then the political divide isn't just, you know, in our country, it's in the workplace.
And you bring up a great trend, a great point of actually a bad trend that's happening around the country, right? This really powerful self-segregation, right? People live in communities where their neighbors all agree exactly with them. And if, you know, you vote differently on one issue, right, even if you're still on team red or team blue, then you're somehow betraying the cause. And so I do think it's challenging for this to happen in organizations. I mean, it happens in dating, right? We've seen over the years that people are really committed to dating someone who agrees with them politically in a way that never used to be true. But I do think you can highlight some kind of deeper agreement rather, and this is what I've tried to, you know, highlight in the book, is that underneath like team red or team blue is a kind of more powerful unifying concern about protecting yourselves, you know, protecting your family, your company, your nation from harm, and kind of working together. And so I think the way you do that is to have conversations with people, right? If I, you know, I have this story that I like to tell about, you know, sitting in an Uber and my driver was a Christian nationalist, right? And not someone that I typically talk with. But, you know, through a conversation, I can, you know, go into how I managed to do this. But through our conversation, I realized that, you know, he's got the kind of deep similarity when it comes to our values. I mean, he's concerned about his family and the fate of the country as well. And so I think that's a way to do it, kind of like get at a deeper similarity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Well, before I throw it back over to Jim, you know, Jim mentioned our sponsor, Darley, and said, hey, you should sign up for their newsletter. They've got a lot of great things. Whether you need water pumps or equipment or anything, you really should sign up, because this is a company that's multi-generational. It's doing the right things because it's about growing and developing people, and they're committed to that whether you're a customer or not. And if you're looking for a company that's really created a great environment, a great culture, it might be someone to benchmark against and to really look at. So again, check out darley.com, darley.com.
Yeah. This is like, this next part is like the crux of like what I've been anticipating for this discussion. Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this. But, you know, we used to have disagreements with people, and you could disagree with people. And we used to, you know, maybe sometimes get a little, you know, oh, you know, I don't like that, but, you know, that's okay. But we've gotten to this point where we're not talking about disagreements anymore. We're talking about outrage, you know, all out outrage. And like back to what Jan was saying earlier, almost to the point where people put people in their circle through purity tests, because like, you almost have to get through this, like there's this intolerance for any imperfection. Things have to be 100% pure and aligned. And so it's just to the point where if there's anything that's not right, it's a level of outrage that is almost nonsensical. And there's also, that goes with this level of outrage, this catastrophization of like, oh my gosh, they're coming for all of us. They're going to kill us, you know? And I don't care if it's for someone who's on one side, you know, saying, oh my gosh, this new law, they're going to kill us all. Or on the other side saying, oh my gosh, they're going to take away this right and that's going to be the end of us all and America is going to cease to exist. Because we have kind of forced upon ourselves this purity of thought that just is intolerant to any deviation. We have reached this point where outrage is the norm. How did we get here? Like, is this just normal? Why are we where we are today?
We're much more divided than we were in the past, that's for sure. I think there's lots of trends that help create this kind of polarization. I mean, you can look at how Congress is structured, the rise of cable news. It used to be that we'd all watch the same 3 news broadcasts on ABC, NBC, or CBS, and now you kind of watch the people that are most ideologically aligned with you. And not to kind of flog a dead horse, but social media is really bad. And we have a bunch of research on it from my lab. And the reason it's so bad is because it is so good at inciting moral panics. So, it used to be back in the day, moral panics would happen, but they would take a while to get going. So Salem witches, reefer madness, Dungeons and Dragons, right? These are things people worried about, but they took a while to kind of take root in the minds of people. Social media is so good at inciting moral panics because it has two features. One of them is a limitless supply of threats, which kind of triggers our, deep mammalian brains. Oh my goodness, right? This is out to get us. And 2, it pairs these threats with virality metrics, right? We're a social species. We rely on our teammates. We rely on our groups. And so if you look at this thread on social media, right, as you say, this law's passed, all right, these rights are under attack. And then you see that thousands of people are retweeting it, thousands of people are yelling about it. You get really terrified, get really worried. And then the only way that we have as humans to kind of enact change at this kind of large, you can't actually get out there, right? You can't get a spear and try to stab it. Instead, you get outraged, right? And that's supposed to motivate all these people to kind of attack the other side. Of course, it doesn't really work, right? Because you get outraged and then the other side gets outraged and then everyone's angry, right? So I think social media is a really bad driver. And I think one reason why these purity tests are so essential, right? Because when we feel like there's threats and there's enemies, then we hunker down onto people who are like us. And then we try to make sure they're just like us.
Yeah, it's crazy. How does that connect with or stories of harm?
Right. So, we're all fixated on, are we getting harmed? Are these folks getting harmed? Right? Who's the real victim? Right? That's what a lot of our debates are about. So take something like immigration, right? Folks on the right think that people who are victimized by undocumented or illegal immigrants are American citizens. On the other hand, folks on the left think that it's kind of the undocumented immigrants themselves who are victims, fleeing violence, let's say, from their home country. And so we're really convinced that the victims that we see are the true victims. And maybe this happens, in the workplace as well, right? There's some kind of dust up, some disagreement, and you're fixated this person's the victim. And then someone else says, no, you're wrong. This other person's the victim. And it turns out that when you're stuck in that kind of moral conflict, what doesn't work is throwing facts at each other, but instead, right, sharing stories of harm, especially your own personal stories, to let people see beyond this disagreement and see you as a person who's worried about harm, worried about threats. So I think that's the pivot that people need to think about. It's less about just arguing about this person's a victim, no, this person is, and instead saying, where do you as a person see harm and where do you feel threatened? And it humanizes you and gets over this kind of dehumanization that Jan mentioned.
I find this fascinating because especially so much of the work that's going on, to help business people be more successful or to help individuals be more successful. If you were to talk to, let's say, a coach like myself, or if I were to be mentoring employees, or if I were to be seeing a therapist, so much of what they would say is hey, don't be a victim. Bad things happen. Control what you can control. Even Stoic philosophy, it's don't worry about all the stuff you can't control. Control what you can't control. Do your best to move yourself forward. Don't focus on that which victimizes you, but focus on that which you can do to put yourself in a better position or to help yourself. And that's like common knowledge. You can find that on the internet. You can find that in social media, like, hey, go out and take on the world today, you know, all these great posts and stuff like that. At an individual level, I think people kind of accept that, okay? Because there's so much of it out there. Yet when we talk about groups, in big, broad groups, you know, oh, it's all about victim mentality. It's like these people are being victimized. These people are being victimized. Everyone's got their victims. Whose victim is more important? You know, why is it that we can't make the jump between like that dialogue we see on, you know, you can see it on LinkedIn every day. Here are 5 ways to improve your job satisfaction, you know, 10 ways to, you know, be a better boss. Or why is it we can't apply that, or it doesn't apply well in the group dynamic?
Well, in the group dynamic, right, we're worried about who's morally right, right? So whenever we have a conflict or competition, then our minds think of competitions when it comes to morality as kind of binary, right? You're either the perp or you're the victim. And so what we're doing when we're saying like we're the victim, our group's the real victim, is we're trying really hard not to be the perpetrator, right? So if you think about personal success, no one's saying, well, you should go out there and be a perpetrator, right? You should be a villain, right? Instead, it's like you should be a hero. You should be the hero of your own story. You know, you should take your agency and achieve change. But in this case of like, well, we've always had this conflict, right? The Middle East, right? Northern Ireland, all these like really old conflicts that some have been raging forever. Some have managed to, you know, to be soothed. Some haven't, right? Those conflicts really hinge on who's the victim, and it's better to be the victim than the perpetrator. And so that's why people stick to it. But I think you're absolutely right. The way to move past these conflicts is to maybe not focus on victimhood. But it turns out that the way to see the other side as more of a human being and less as a villain is to understand that they too also feel like a victim and their claims have some legitimacy, right? So if everyone's kind of more in the middle, right, you've done some bad things, but you've also experienced some bad things, that's a kind of whole human being, and we can appreciate that. But we can't caricature people as either one or the other, because then again, it flattens us, right? And it doesn't allow us to move past it.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that gets in direct conflict with kind of the purity mechanism we put in place, you know, because, you know, we can't be in the middle because we can't recognize someone, you know, we want people who are perfect and have no faults. It's just, it's this like endless trap.
It's so hard. I mean, you could just have an argument with your spouse, right? Like you're having some dust up with them and you're like, well, you don't do this, and I'm always the one that has to clean this up. And then you could be like, well, you never do this, and I'm always the one that has to like take care of this. And it's always like, I'm 100% the victim and you're 100% the villain. And obviously with your spouse, you want to move past that. And so, you know what, you are right. You know, sometimes I'm a little thoughtless, whatever, right? But I think in these kind of moral competitions, especially when there's groups involved and you want to be pure, as you say, right? You're not willing to accept any fault. It gets real hard.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Cartman drama triangle, if you're familiar with that, that there's a victim, villain, and hero. And once you jump in, you know, you're going to be a victim. If you're the hero, you jump in and, you know, you might be the hero for 2 seconds, but then you're the villain. And then when you're the villain, you're like, oh, I'm the victim. And, you know, and we see it at work all the time. And the theory is, you know, the victim needs to be a creator. The hero needs to be a coach, and the villain needs to be a challenger, is the whole idea of the Cartman drama triangle. So
interesting. I hadn't heard about it in the workplace. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we see it all the time. Everybody's a victim, you know, everybody, you know, and again, and that's where a lot of leaders go wrong. They don't basically call it out and go, you know, hey, you've got some agency here. Come on. But let me pivot to talk about the paradox of vulnerability with you. I lead crucible expeditions where we got in the wilderness with executives and veterans, and a lot of people, you know, one of the hesitancies of going out there is, I don't want to be vulnerable. But when we've seen people that are really confident, they can be really vulnerable, and that vulnerable feeds their confidence. When you write about paradox of vulnerability with regard to morality and all that, what is it you're trying to convey?
Yeah, great question. And I think maybe before we get there, I just want to say maybe one thing about victimhood, which is that even though we're all arguing about it, or in fact, because there's a truth there, which is that we can all recognize the importance of escaping harm and feeling worried and trying to protect ourselves. Like that's ultimately what victimhood is about, right? And so in the seeds of this disagreement about victimhood, there's a way of reconciliation because we can understand how someone who's very different than me might still be concerned about protecting themselves. And that's where the vulnerability paradox comes in, which is if you want to connect across differences, right? And this is why like trips like what you explain are so powerful at connecting people, right? So when I was a geophysicist, I was stuck in the wilderness with 4 other guys on a team, and we were stuck overnight, and it was cold, and it was snowing, and there was a lynx stalking us, right? We were very vulnerable to the elements, and we bonded incredibly, right, over that day stuck in the wilderness. And the reason we bonded is because we were forced to be vulnerable with each other, because we all knew we were in trouble, we were hungry, we were tired, we were cold. But I think when your lives are not, on the line, it's harder to kind of open yourself up to someone and let them recognize that you too could be afraid, you too could be vulnerable. And so the way around that, the way to be comfortable being vulnerable with others is in fact by trying to get other people to be comfortable being vulnerable with you, and then you open up as a consequence, as a way of kind of repaying their vulnerability. And so the way you do that is asking questions, which seems very simple, but is actually very hard. The more questions you ask of someone about how they're feeling, how they're thinking, where they came from, that opens people up, and then it allows you to be vulnerable with them, right? Always ask one more question.
I wish I could have total recall on this, but I read about some research, and maybe Kurt, where back in the olden days, people used to talk to each other on the airplane.
Yeah.
And there was this article that was written that you shouldn't start off with a stranger with small talk. If you really want to engage, you start off with the big questions, like right away. And it seems that, again, our interpersonal skills have waned over the years. But are you aware of any research that says, again, that we could use in the business world as leaders, that the big questions are okay to ask early on? We don't have to have this long, enduring, beautiful relationship before we really get into the hard questions.
Absolutely. And I touched on this a little bit in the book. So there's some research done by Nick Epley at the University of Chicago, and I love his studies. And so what he does is randomly assigns people taking the train in from the suburbs of Chicago. So these are people, they're not total strangers, they see each other on the train, but you might at most nod to someone and say, "Oh, weather's pretty hot, isn't it?" Boring small talk. He asks them, how comfortable do you think it would be? How much do you think you would enjoy it if you talked to someone about really big questions, right? How do you think you're going to die? When was your first love? Like what does life mean to you? And they'll say, "Oh, wow, that sounds real awkward. I would never want to do it." But then he makes some people do it. You're going to sit down and you're going to ask people, what was it like to lose your first pet? Or something like that, right? When was the last time you cried? It turns out that people love those conversations. They love a chance to connect with people, especially in this kind of epidemic of loneliness we're having. They're connecting, they're feeling heard, they're asking questions about them, right? It's a chance for this deep connection. So I think if you are trying to bond your team together as a leader, how can you build rapport? How can you build camaraderie? Right? It's not about, hey, ask each other about, what's your favorite color, or, I don't know, where'd you go to school? We banal questions that we do at parties, right? Ask these deep questions and you will bond people much faster and they'll be much happier for it.
Oh, fascinating.
I really like that. I think that's interesting. You got my mind racing, but I want to dive into a couple things. First, I think, there's a lot of talk these days. People like, oh, rise and fall of civilizations. And, we're in this decline. And, how did Rome fall? And how did all these other civilizations fall? And, I think I could chalk a lot of that away as just catastrophizing. And then, but when you were just talking with Jan about like this elemental level, we connect on vulnerability and like we kind of share our vulnerabilities and those things we think that are kind of threaten us or put us in a vulnerable spot. Is it kind of like almost self-created because we have a society where we have everything? Like literally we are living at the best time in human history. People in third world countries have cell phones. We have, but we are dealing at a time where, yes, bad things happen. There are people that are hungry and starving. There are people that are abused and enslaved, but generally the world has never been better. So on a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like we're pretty far up. When you get up to these high levels of like suffering or not suffering, where we're like really doing well, is that what allows us to catastrophize or like to we need to find something to bond with? We need to be vulnerable about something. So it's got to be like, it's not about staying cold through the night or not having the lynx or the mountain lion get us. It's about like, oh my gosh, did you hear about the new bill Congress just passed? That's our vulnerability. Is that what's going on? We have it too good.
In a sense, yeah, that's exactly what's going on. So our minds are hardwired for millions of years to find threats. And we are going to look until we find those threats. And if those threats are not obvious, like starving to death or freezing to death, right, we will look and find them somewhere else. And so, everyone worries about their kids. From millions of years, we've worried about our kids. And maybe back in the day, we worried about our kids getting eaten by mountain lions or giant eagles. Today, fewer mountain lions on the way to school, right? Fewer eagles. But it turns out, right, our kids are so safe today. But if you saw a white panel van drive slowly up the street and then back down, right, you don't think, oh, I wonder if it's a lost locksmith. I should ask, if they need help finding a house, right? You think, oh my goodness, they're kidnappers. Kids never get kidnapped, right? And if they do, they get kidnapped by their their parent, their dad or their stepdad or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And they never get kidnapped by strangers, but our minds still are worried about it, right? So the safer we are, the more we take minor threats and we expand them in our minds to be big threats, right? Even, I talked to my mom while I was writing the book, and she was like, yeah, when I was a kid, I knew a ton of kids that drowned in the lake or got locked in a fridge and suffocated, or there was no child locked doors. They just like rolled out the car at highway speeds. That was terrible. And now today we're like, oh my goodness, can kids walk home by themselves for 10 minutes? I don't know. Right. And so this creep of harm, we call it, I call it in the book, the idea of what is harmful has crept because we're not facing as severe threats anymore.
Yeah. I love this discussion. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about, I think, something that's,
Hey, Jim, before you do, I just want to tag on to something real quick. Kurt, you said about, looking where threats. Something I think you wrote was if you've seen a threat somewhere, every time you look there, you're going to look for that threat. Like in the past, if you saw a mountain lion on this rock, every time you look at that rock, you're looking to see if a mountain lion is that equate to the work world where the boss was mean to me or a person was this or somebody. I mean, is that something that we're hyper vigilant? If a threat's happened in a place, we're always there as almost in victim mode.
You bet. I mean, our minds evolved fundamentally to protect us from harm. And part of that is by really paying attention to places where we might have felt harmed or victimized in the past. Like if you got mugged walking home one day at a particular intersection, you will always remember that intersection and likely start to avoid it, right? If you, had a negative interaction with your boss, I mean, not just negative, but you felt like really kind of victimized, or heaven forbid you got laid off, right? At a particular office, like that will always come to mind when you see it. And so you can reappraise it. You can do all sorts of things psychologically to get over it, but it's hard to get over it.
Yeah. You took me to a few places where I had bad experience at work. Just by saying that, you took me to like 3 or 4 places. Yeah,
It's
that's
funny.
it's interesting how powerful the mind is, for good or
Yeah, I mean, you could have 100 good experiences at a place, and then you have one bad experience, and all of a sudden, right, boom, flips the switch.
Well, it goes back to the fact that we should, as leaders, take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. We really honestly should. But thankfully I had a boss that told me, when I was getting ready to go take on management, he goes, do no harm. I
Well,
didn't always,
not to, maybe I think this is in the book a little bit, but we often think about paying it forward when we think about leaders, like I'm going to do good and that's going to do good. I've got some studies that show that what really gets paid forward are bad things, right? There's this phrase that says hurt people hurt people. And so if you feel bullied, you're going to likely to bully someone else. And so the best thing you can do as a leader is, of course, be kind, but really it's not to be cruel. As you say, Hippocratic oath, just don't be a jerk. And that goes much further than being really kind sometimes and being a jerk other times. Just try to be fair, and that gets you a lot further.
Yeah.
Great counsel.
I know we could talk for a lot longer. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your acronym, CIVIL, because I think that speaks to, what we can do. I think I have a much better understanding of the problem and the source of just how our humanity will naturally create this problem. Let's talk about something on the solution side or on the adaptation side, let's say.
Right. And I think it's so important to talk about the solutions, right? Because often, we're confronted with conversations we're worried about. We know this person disagrees with us. How do we approach this conversation? And the way to do it is not just to go in there and be like, hey, I heard you voted for this person. Hey, I heard you think about it this way, right? It's not the way. And so CIV, connect, invite, validate, is the beginning of more civil conversations. And it's a set of tips that I picked up from practitioners who really are into bridging divides. And so connect is, before you talk about politics, you first connect as human beings. And what this means is, going back to our conversation earlier, asking questions, right? People are so much richer than whether they voted left or right, red or blue, right? You can ask them about food, music, their kids. I was at a New Year's party and started talking with someone about space. This guy loves space and rockets, and I had no idea, right? And now we talk for 20 minutes about his love of space and how he was a kid and he was, launched those little bottle rockets. And now, even if he disagrees with me politically, I know that wow, this guy's really into something that is interesting and human in a deep sense. And so once you connect with someone by asking them all sorts of questions, then you can invite them to share their beliefs. And it has to be a real invitation, right? Not a forced. So one, a not real invitation is like, Jim, explain to me, tell me how you voted for this guy. That's not an invitation, right? An invitation is something where you are motivated to understand. That's the key word, understand. Jim, I know in the election you voted differently than I did. And, I'm just really curious. I'd like to understand, your thoughts, your feelings, and what kind of in your past maybe led you to think that was a decision that, that made sense to you and your family. And if now's not the time to talk about it, I totally understand. We can talk later, but I just love to understand. Right. That's an invitation. And then maybe, you share your beliefs. You feel vulnerable with me, that you're being vulnerable, sharing your beliefs, you're baring your neck in a sense, if we go to the kind of predator prey feeling. And then the V of connect, invite, validate is validate rather. And so for that, I don't need to agree with you, but I need to appreciate that you have been vulnerable. Jim, thanks a lot for sharing that. as you know, I have some different beliefs, but I really appreciate you putting your thoughts into words, especially because it can be so hard to kind of, share your thoughts. And, in a bit, maybe I could share where I'm coming from and it's different, but I just want to say thank you for sharing those thoughts. And that's really different than saying, yeah, but what about this? Right. Which is what we often first do, right? Like you barely take a half breath before you argue something else, right? You need to pause. You need to validate. Thanks so much. And then maybe you can present your opinion, right? But it's not just, I'm only listening to what you say so I can argue back, right? Instead, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from and who you are. And once you do that CIV, it goes a long way. I teach it in my class, right? I teach it to execs. It goes a long way.
Yeah. This is really a great book, and I've already recommended to a lot of people, and Jim and I get a lot of books. But when I look at the subtitle, morality, when I think of morals, it's like that's a personal thing. When I think of ethics, I think of the group. So you have morality and politics. The politics is the group. So there's two things. And you can have your own morals and be in an organization where the organization has certain ethics. And we often say to people, you've got to decide if the values that you have and you possess match that of the organization, and if they don't, you got to decide. For most of us in the United States, we can't just decide, hey, I don't like what's going on, I'm going to leave the country. I think your book is a really good instrument by which, we can disagree, but, again, in the subtitle, it's how to find common ground. And I think that's not only applicable to our country, I think it's applicable to the workplace where, there's so much conflict and disagreement. We know from the Gallup survey, we're lucky if 1/3 of people are actually engaged, going above and beyond. It's even worse for the managers. And again, the reason we work is not just to make money and take care of our families. We work, in the service of other human beings to make other people's lives better. And I'm wondering, there's so much here. I mean, it's dense, and it's evidence based, and it's just awesome. But I'm wondering how you would, kind of wrap this up for folks. Not everybody's a reader. Not everybody's going to buy a book and read it. They listen to podcasts. But what's the one thing that, and again, this is a tall order here, Kurt, but what's the one thing you really want to make sure that people take away and maybe do, that they do something?
Right. I think the takeaway is actually fairly simple. And that is when you're confronted with someone who disagrees with you, what you should do is first ask yourself, what harms do they see? Right? That one step, it takes you out of your own mind into the mind of the person you're disagreeing with. And I know leaders, it's really important to kind of have theory of mind, right, for other folks, right? It takes you out of your mind into someone else's mind and allows you to see the world through their eyes. And it allows you to meet them where they're at.
Yep.
Right? Once you know the harms that people are seeing, things that they're worried about, it allows you to meet them where they're at. And only then can you understand what motivates them, how to make sense of their world, how to even persuade them, right? That requires seeing the harms that they see.
Yeah.
Yeah. This has been a wonderful discussion. The hour absolutely flew by.
Yeah.
I can't recommend this book enough. Kurt, thank you for being a guest on our show.
Been great. Thank you.
Yeah. And for our listeners, that's all we have for you this week. We'll include ways for you to connect with Kurt and how to buy his book in our show notes. So make sure you find all that information out at theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, morality is not the doctrine of how we may make ourselves happy, but how we may make ourselves worthy of happiness. Immanuel Kant. It's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.